All right, welcome today. It's a really very important topic we're going to be discussing. It is China, how China became an economic giant and an international, and what it means for your investments, for my investments, for investments around the world. What does it really mean? I think there's very, very few topics for investors that are more important to understand than what's happening in China. How did they get there? And what it really means. I mean, it's a very fascinating story. It took me a while to get this all put together and figure it out. I lived in France for a year and a half, so I had some background to help with this. How did France really become the power they are? Pardon me. In 1970, France had a GDP of $92 billion. The US, $1 trillion. We were more than 100 times bigger than China. Today, China's GDP in 2021 was 19.6 billion. We were 30 billion, 31 billion. They grew 200-fold while we grew 30-fold. Worldwide GDP from 12 billion to 117 billion. But you can see China's grown so much faster than anyone would have expected. But you know what? They had a model. They had a model in which gave them the reason, the resources, and what to do to grow 200-fold in 40 years. We're both large competitors. Who's going to win? China's been very public about wanting to replace the US as world leader. Well, I'll give you my thoughts at the end. And I want to add to this. I first did this presentation in 2018 or 2019. I did it following a newsletter in which I spelled all this out. I was really excited about doing it because I thought I'd tumble onto something. That newsletter went to a reader who was Chinese American. He sent it to one of the members of the Politburo in China, who wrote back and said, Mike Adams has written really well. He's described what went on, but he's wrong. China will win. I'm not sure that's true, and I'm going to tell you why at the end. But how did they get there? They had a model. They had a model from France in 1661. I lived in France for a year and a half when I first started a job. It was, in 1661, the legacy of Jean-Baptiste Colbert. In 1661, Louis XIV became king. In 1661, France was close to bankruptcy. They'd been fighting 3 major wars and 2 minor wars. Their economy was backwards. They depended on small craft people. You know, you can think of it, the tailors, the candlestick makers, the bakers. That's what France was in 1661. They didn't compete globally. They were very backward. They were really in financial difficulties. They didn't have paper money in those days. Everything was specie. Either you had gold or silver. And France had no gold mines. They didn't have silver mines. They were at a huge disadvantage. King Louis XIV, I used the Roman numerals, XIV, X being 10, IV being 4. King Louis XIV became king, and he brought in Jean-Baptiste Colbert as his Minister of Finance. And it would be Colbert that modernized the French economy. He built up the glass and textile industries. Some of them exist today. Saint-Gobain, Saint-Gobain, they are huge industries that were begun during that period of time. And what Jean-Baptiste Colbert did is that he poached the craftsmen. He offered incentives to people in Italy and Germany and England and around Europe to move to France and begin to build their factories in France. And they offered incentives, the royal privilege. They would not tax them. They had no taxes to pay. The state would completely finance what they were doing, and they would guarantee the sales. They guaranteed that all the products that these companies move would be sold. And they sent spies to England and around the world to find skilled tradesmen. That's what they did, 1661 through the early 16s. And in doing that, they stole secret production and machinery. The first English steam engine was shipped to France, where they copied it and began to produce a steam engine in France. But as they moved along, they had to protect their stolen intellectual property, something that they wrote laws to protect that property. If you look at it, incidentally, that same thing happened in the United States when we were a very young country. So, not uncommon. Once in France, those skilled tradesperson could not leave. If you were caught leaving, you were punished. You might end up rowing on the king's galley boat. You might end up being executed. In fact, they they did execute. They, in France, under Jean-Baptiste Colbert, actually established a corps of state-funded industrial inspectors to ensure that quality was superb and to check and make sure the entrepreneurs who they funded stayed in France. They protected from outside. For example, France began to produce glass. If you go to Venice today, you see the glassworks that are in Venice. Venice was noted worldwide for having the most impressive and expensive glassware ever. So France imported that. France imported entrepreneurs from Italy to establish and do the same thing. And 15,000 small entrepreneurs were executed for the crime of importing or manufacturing cotton cloth. The same thing happened with glass. Today, there's a couple French companies that were established in the 1670s that are some of the greatest glass makers in the world today. What Baptiste did is he built the first French factories. Remember, they were a backward country when Baptiste became treasurer of the Treasury Secretary. They had just craftspeople, but Jean-Baptiste Colbert wanted to build factories that could employ 1,000 people or more, paid the minimum of wages to these people, built dormitories, and expected them to work 14 to 16 hours a day, minimum wages. He complained actually to the Roman Catholic Church because they had Catholic holidays off. Those were the only days off that people had that worked in those factories. They worked 7 days a week, 14 to 16 hours a day. But Colbert believed that there were too many holidays and too many days off they had. And as Colbert started that project, they had a large rural population and high unemployment. But he encouraged women under 20 to marry and have children so that there would be more workers for the factories. He wanted women to marry very young, have families, and bring those families up in the dormitories. And he brought that same mentality to international trade. Up until the 17th century, the Dutch dominated. But Colbert gave preference to ships with French goods, so that ships that either carried French goods or carried goods that were used in France always had lower fees when they docked at French ports. If you didn't have goods that were going to be French made, you paid a much higher fee. And he restricted competitive imports. So if you were producing glass or cloth or whatever you might be producing, you had a tariff that was placed on anything that competed with you. And he subsidized exports of exceptionally fine products. Doesn't it sound like some of what we're seeing today? And he was ruthless, determined. He was able, full control of finances, France. And he was nasty. He was hated both inside and outside of France. But you know what? He built a trade surplus that funded the economy. French industry became known for quality, for luxury goods, silk and tapestries, fine glass. Saint-Gobain, the glassmaker, Gobelin Tapestry today. Those are huge French companies that were started during the time of Colbert. And he launched France on a path of large-scale industrialization. Mercantilism is what it's called. It's the model for China. Think about it. How did China grow from 92 billion to 19 trillion, 200-fold in 40 years? 10 times faster than the US grew. That was the pattern for China in the 20th century. Think about that. The Communist Party has broad centralized control. They control the land, they control the banks, they control the infrastructure, they control foreign policy, and they have a long-term development plan. The government's focused on expanding China's role globally. Their plan can be done because the government controls the key industries. They either own the industries or they finance the industries, and they control the domestic policies that can promote exports, just as the French did by subsidizing those industries. And we've seen that in steel and aluminum and solar panels. And we're seeing it today in electric vehicles and other things as well. They can create a trade surplus, and they've been able to go out and acquire modern technology and build a domestic base capable of innovation. The government is able to do that, and they go forward in building huge factories as well. The large companies in critical industries are fully government owned. Majority of the companies allows them to draw on government financing. And even in the non-critical industries, China controls those companies as well. We'll talk more about that. And they have given significant incentive for foreign manufacturing to come in. They provided during that period of time, that 40 years, from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, they provided really low-cost labor. They built modern infrastructure, and they convinced companies to move manufacturing to China. If you look today, 70% of the exports that come out of China are from relocated plants. Many of those American plants who built factories in China and then shipped the products back to the United States. There's an example that I was partially involved with. HAECO is an aircraft factory. When passenger planes become older, become 15 or 18 or 20 years old, they become less and less efficient as time goes along. And what happens is those planes are often converted from a passenger plane to freighter planes to be used by Federal Express or some of the other freight companies. And what they do is they take the plane, they redo the skin, the outside of the plane, getting rid of the windows. They strip down the inside of the plane. They put in conveyor belts. They put in a big cargo door. And with a couple pilots, they can fly those planes and they become passenger planes. Boeing has the technology. They do certification of those planes, and Boeing owned 15% of HAECO. HAECO was built on a duck pond. There used to be huge numbers of ducks. And what the Chinese government did is they came in, since they control the land, they control the permits, they control the construction crews, they came in, completely covered the duck ponds in concrete. They built dormitories. They built dormitories and housed 15,000 workers in the beginning. They were converting Boeing 747s from passenger planes into freighter planes. Those people in those those dormitories worked long hours and they were cheap labor. You know, it, Takeo, China owned a part of that factory. They ended up having the technology to build aircraft. And the key technology in aircraft, the key thing in the efficiency of an aircraft is in the wing of the airport, of the plane. The wing is crucial to the efficiency of the plane. Takeo now has all that technology on a 747. And like Kohler, they were able to bring in and convince Boeing to do that as the 15% partner, and a couple other partners, the aircraft companies and freight companies, and they built that plant. But that's just one example. Foxconn makes Apple products, employs 100,000 workers doing it. They have dormitories for city workers, and they have facilities for up to an additional 300,000 workers. China brought in high-speed trains. They brought them in from Japan, technology from Japan and the Netherlands. And of course, they now manufacture their own trains. And Japan and the Netherlands sued China because they said that they were stealing their technology. China simply claimed they improved them, and now they compete with Japan and the Netherlands. Just like Jean-Baptiste Colbert in France in the 1670s. Yeah. So how did it end for France? How did it end for France? Think about France, 1789, 100 years later, people lost their heads over the whole thing. France had become an economic power at the time, the largest in the Western world. The French Revolution ended the line of French kings, but with a powerful economy, Napoleon Bonaparte set out to build the French Empire in the early 1800s. France was a huge economic empire. And Bonaparte succeeded the French Revolution, succeeded after the Revolution. And what did he do? This is what he did. France, a backward country in 1661 that had enormous debts, that had no industry to support and pay. They didn't have gold mines or silver mines, so they had no way to manufacture money. But under Jean-Baptiste Colbert and what he built as an industrial power or a business power, France had the economic power to expand most of Spain, Germany, even into Russia, into Italy. That was the French Empire. It was built because they had become the largest economic power in the world at that time. That's how it went. So what's happening with China? Think about China today. China, Made in China 2025. Their plan they came out with in 2017, Xi Jinping, the World Time magazine, or The Economist called him the most powerful man in the world. And his message in 2017 was pursue the dream of rejuvenation. He wanted, 2017, they had a plan called Made in China 2025. That was last year. They wanted to dominate the world's high-tech industries, medical. They wanted to dominate computers. They wanted to dominate telecommunications. They wanted to dominate in electrical vehicles, advanced and basic materials, mobile devices, agricultural machinery, and robotics. China wanted to replace America as the world leader. And think about it today, where they stand. BYD, the largest electric vehicle maker in the world, today is Chinese. Build your dream. Today, they lead in robotics. They're making mobile devices. And their whole point is to dominate America as a world leader. They wanted to rebuild and export and rebuild the Silk Road. And remember, the Silk Road was from medieval times, but it wasn't just one area. This was the old-time Silk Road. Think about it. It traveled to the north. It traveled to the south. It traveled through the Middle East and reached the Mediterranean. That was the old Silk Road. And that is the Silk Road of today as well. Because China wants to reconstruct the Silk Planet. For China, it was the project of the century. It was called the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is what they wanted to do. This is the economic belt they want to build. This is the Silk Road, this economic road. This was the economic cooperation, the Silk Maritime, to control the sea, to control the land, and to build Chinese military bases. You can see they're beginning to dominate Asia and into Europe. They want to dominate the South Sea, South Asian Sea, South China Sea. They are ready to finance it with the Belt and Road Initiative. They want to reach Europe through the Middle East. They want to build a Pacific Silk Road. They want to build the Silk Road on ice via the Arctic Ocean. And they want to build the digital Silk Road. They're committing trillions of dollars to the infrastructure. They're investing in roads and railways, ports, power stations all around the world. They are funding companies and countries. Countries like Azerbaijan and Georgia benefit enormously. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, economically strengthened and helped. And with China's idea that those stop Islamic terrorism from taking hold in those countries. And they're committing trillions of dollars to do that. They want to do that, and their aid comes with a price tag, because you can't question China's human rights violation. You can't question corruption. You can't question intellectual property. They require the use of Chinese labor, and countries are deeply indebted to China. Deeply indebted. I think of one country in Africa. I had a friend who was hired for an engineering project in Liberia. And in Liberia, they had roads that wiped out during the monsoon season. And they had a lot of plantations where you needed road transportation. The Chinese loaned the money to Liberia to put in the roads. And every year, the roads got wiped out. And every year, they have to come back and borrow the money from China again. They just move forward on that. Pakistan. You couldn't get money from an IMF bailout, but they could from China, because China wants to control. Hambantota, a big thing. So Sri Lanka, Hambantota is Sri Lanka, number 2 port in Sri Lanka. They needed to modernize the port, so they turned to China. China loaned the money through Chinese companies, not directly from the Chinese government, but through Chinese companies. And they rebuilt the port with the loaning money to Sri Lanka, loaning it to the government, with Sri Lanka having an option to pay those bonds off and pay the interest. And when Sri Lanka couldn't pay off the debt, the Chinese companies repossessed the entire port. A quarter of the Chinese Navy now sits in Hambantota. That's the kind of thing that they did. But it's a matter of culture. I've talked before. I started my career at Intalco, aluminums. It was an aluminum smelter. It was half French owned, half American owned. The technology was French technology. Alcoa, Hall came out with the technology at Alcoa in the 1800s. Harol came out with the technology in France in the 1800s, and they built an aluminum empire in the US with Alcoa and the other companies, and in France, Pétionnet. Pétionnet owned half of Intalco. And through the whole thing, there's a different culture that takes place in the French education. It's a French, let me share. You know, kids start out in kindergarten, first grade, just like they do here. But the educational system in France at the age of 12, you have your first test. And if you don't pass the test, you go to work like on a garbage truck or in a beauty salon. You see kids 12 years old or 13 or 14 years old riding in a garbage truck. You see, at that time, it was girls in beauty salons. That is their future. 12 years old determines their future for the rest of their life. If you pass the test, you move on, and you come to a second test when you're 18 years old called the baccalaureate, the bac. And the bac determines whether you go to college or you go to work somewhere. And it also determines to which college you get into. So if you don't go to work, for example, you might go to work for an aluminum smelter. In France, all those smelters had people that had not passed the bac. They moved into the aluminum smelter. They became workers. If you were a good worker and an organizer, you could become a foreman, and you could be promoted to general foreman. And that was a glass ceiling. No one that had passed the bac, had not passed the bac, ever achieved a position higher than a general foreman in those plants. If you passed the bac, it determined where you went to school. And if you passed the bac, the top three schools in France were Polytechnique, Centrale, and École de Mines. Actually, École de Mines was the second school. Centrale was the third largest. All three of those schools were engineering schools. And what you did, if you graduated in the bottom three quarters of your class from one of those three schools, you parachuted into a company like Pétionnet. And you began to work as an engineer. You began to work in management as an assistant to the manager of the furnace lines or whatever. And you became a superintendent. And then you worked up the management chain, and you could work up almost to the top. And once again, you reached a glass ceiling. So the entire middle management was filled with people who had engineering backgrounds. But they were also the most intelligent French, the very most intelligent French. But those who graduated in the top quarter of the class, in the top quarter, they didn't go to work for the industries, they went to work for the government. And you worked 20 years in the government or 30 years or whatever it might be. And then you parachuted into one of the top jobs, into a CFO or a CEO or president, executive vice president of one of the French companies. I started at Intalco. I graduated in the bottom three quarters of my class from Carnegie Mellon and Carnegie Mellon. I got my MBA, and graduating in the bottom three quarters of my class, I fit the French French model, I guess I would call it. Carnegie Mellon was an engineering school where you could focused on quantitative methods, get your MBA. Time Magazine in 1965, the year I graduated from Oregon State with math degree, they picked Carnegie Mellon as the top business school in the country. Used to be a competition when I was at Carnegie Mellon. Who was better, Harvard or Carnegie Mellon? Two different approaches, case studies versus quantitative analysis. Anyway, I fit the pattern. I came out. I ended up parachuting into Intaco, starting as a management trainee, working for the president of the company, and eventually became superintendent of the carbon plant. That was the French system. But as nice as they are, and as close as a democracy as they are to the US, what happens when your top students become the top executives in companies? In 1982, when France went through a budget deficit, what they did is they nationalized patient A. Simply said, okay, we'll fill our budget deficit by nationalizing patient A. All the stockholders lost out. Credit Lyonnais, taken over by the government. They nationalized. And from 1982 to 1995, a lot of patient A subsidiaries, like their copper and bronze portion of the metals company, were sold off to pay down debt. Credit Lyonnais was sold off to pay down debt. 1982 to 1995. I'm familiar. And in 1995, the government again is running a deficit. And how do you cover a deficit? You do an IPO and make patient a public company once again. Sell the stock to the shareholders. 13 years after you nationalized it, you sell it again. Culture matters. Credit Lyonnais, in the meantime, had gone bankrupt. In 13 years, the government running it had put it into bankruptcy. France is very close to the US as a democracy. And if it can happen in France, it happens in Germany, in England, in Italy, and Greece, and all those other countries. That's what happens. Culture matters. And to understand China, you have to understand their culture. It's a centrally driven culture. Their goal is made in China 2025. They wanted to replace America as the leader in business, in finance. They wanted to replace America, my country, as a world power. And they wanted to make sure it was consistent with Chinese technology. That was their focus. 2017 to last year, they wanted to dominate. And in many areas, they are beginning to dominate. I've done programs and podcasts before when I talk about US corporate executives, like the CEO of Ford, who looked and visited China and felt what they are doing could replace us completely. Robotics, dark factories. They're called dark factories because they're so automated, you don't even have to turn on the lights at night. The robots do the entire production. Now, I'm not sure that it's really true that that's everything going on, because I have had that experience as well. But they do. They actually, when they were stealing technology, and growing as they did, they stole the technology. But in 2017, they realized that they needed to protect their own property. They were developing their own property. And so in 2017, they reorganized their intellectual property courts. Prior to that time, some of the judges that were over those courts didn't even have a high school education. all of that changed in 2017 with Made in China 2025. They had to have college degrees, law degrees, and they had to have a specialty in intellectual property. And China came out with incentives. If you got a patent, you could get a national award, you could get a provincial award, you could get a city award. And the cost of filing the patent was 85% deferred. And look at what that did. You could get up to $150,000, more than $150,000, if you got an awarded patent on a national basis, if it had that much significance. If you got a provincial, you could get 10,000. And some cities also gave patents. And look at what happened. In 2010, the Chinese had 30,000 patents. By 2020, 2.4 million, almost 2.4 million. Look at the growth of that, 80-fold. In the US, in comparison, in 2010, we had 241,000 patents, almost 242,000. That had only grown to 352. China, eight times as many patents as the US. And of course, a lot of those patents are not worth a lot, but it shows that China wants to compete technology. So how does that all play out? Well, think about it in terms of Cyberspace Administration of China. It was formed to regulate the digital Silk Road. And what they wanted is their internet companies, those type of companies, the algorithm companies, they wanted them to be consistent in terms of regulating and controlling cyberspace. One event which had a significant impact on China was Edward Snowden in 2014. Edward Snowden, if you remember, downloaded NSA documents, all the secret documents and information from the United States, and then left the country, intended to sell it. He had all of our secrets. That had a significant impact on China. China worried about some of their people doing exactly the same thing. And so they set up a department of what they called the Internet Security Emergency Command Center, an Agency Service Center, an Illegal and Unhealthy Information Reporting Center. All of that to control what went on. They wanted to be sure that everything on the internet was done according to Chinese culture. And they appointed Liu Wei. Until 2016, he had been head of Beijing Propaganda Department. He had 60,000 workers working for him. He had 2 million on the payroll. And all the websites under his direction, because he's in charge of administering every website in China, have to use these official standard media reports with regard to the detention of trouble, and they'll retain and do away with attorneys. And under Liu Wei's, the censorship, they wanted to make sure that no website contained any information that harmed national security, that harmed their honor or interest, or damaged any China religious policies. They wanted no spreading of rumors. They didn't want to disturb the public order. And they wanted to make sure, because Chinese is in characters, that you couldn't combine Chinese characters to avoid censorship. And since June of 2021, they put in place policies to control social media, e-commerce, lending, and other businesses, so that the Chinese Internet Investment Fund, formed 5 years ago or 6 years ago, just gets to buy 1% of ownership in all internet-related companies. And there's 130,000 private and JV companies. Maybe it's even larger today because this is data that dates a couple of years ago. The number of companies grew from 14% to 33% in 2015, and I'm sure it's much larger today. Last data I had was 2015, much larger today. And China controls it. Their main concerns is making sure that the companies adhere to communist ideology. They don't care if the companies are losing money, the Chinese government will fund them if they're losing money. And consider that, there's been a lot of talk about TikTok and American ownership of TikTok in America because it gives a great deal of insight into the people that are using TikTok. ByteDance owns TikTok. And Wu Shugang was appointed to the board. His background was in propaganda. He had no business background. And the founder of ByteDance, Shang Yiming, had to step down 1 month after Wu was appointed. And he was replaced by Leng Rubo, who became head of HR and buying, or in the person in charge of overseeing who was hired. It is the future of competition. We face a time in which I have to question whether COVID-19 was the Pearl Harbor moment. World War II saw dramatic changes in nuclear and computers, pharmaceuticals. Will we see changes that way? Will we see things changing in lifestyle, education, home building? We saw all those things happening in the follow-up to World War II. Will we see changes in lifestyles? Will we see changes in demographics? World War II saw huge changes in demographics, women joining the workforce, expectancy, migration from older cities in the Midwest to the West and South. If you look at where we stand today, the Standard & Poor's, 2/3 of the companies are manufacturing, GDP, 2/3 consumption. 50% of sales come from overseas, and this is changing as we onshore things. GDP has only 10% international trade. We're living in a time, and I want to skip through some things because I could go through a lot more. What I want to say is that we live at a time in which the competition is truly there. And who will win? That's the big question. I had an experience. I went to Romania. I went to the country of Georgia and saw what happens with central control. And both those countries came apart in the 1990s. But prior to that, I was in Romania in 1972. I was in Georgia after that came down, but saw the impact of business and the central control of those businesses. There's a huge difference between American companies and the Chinese company. The Chinese economy, if you look at it in summary, grew from 92 billion to 13 trillion. In a period of time, they grew, and that's an old slide, sorry about that. They've grown to 19 billion, 200 times what we've grown to. But if you look at and can make a comparison, an analogy, the Chinese country is, the Chinese focus to business is like a well-cultivated agricultural field. All the rows are straight. Everything is consistent. If you look at the field growing, everything looks very consistent. It's watered, it's plowed, everything is consistent. If you look at the American economy in comparison, we're like a rainforest. We have weeds growing everywhere. We have things going. we are creative. And that's the advantage we have in the US. That's where we are. That's what's going on. I think America will win the battle because we're focused on entrepreneurship and creativeness, whereas the Chinese economy is a very cultivated, centrally controlled economy. And that's the difference between the US and China. You have to understand all of that to understand where the competition is, because as we look into times like we're living now and knowing the investments we have now, our investments are not just competition with other American companies. They can be competition with Chinese companies or Indonesian companies or French companies. We have to understand the culture and the advantages that America brings compared to what China brings. That is where we are today. I think that's fascinating. It also gives a real reason to understand the full value of what you're investing in. I hope that taking this time is giving you some insight into what's going on in China and gives you insight into your own investments. Certainly everything we do at Adams Financial Concepts is focused on understanding our competitors, the companies we own, understanding the competitors, understanding the future, understanding the weaknesses, and understanding the strengths of what we invest in. And we consider very, very strongly what the competition is doing and where our companies have a significant advantage in what they're doing. We're looking for companies that have a franchise on their market. We're looking for companies that have a squeaky clean balance sheet for the most part. And we're looking for companies that have pricing power and have an advantage over their competition. So much that they have a franchise on what they're doing. That's understanding that China is focused on dominating the world, dominating financially, dominating militarily, dominating economically, and dominating industries. Will they win? I don't think so. I think they're centrally controlled. I gave the example of Takeo. Takeo's struggling with its own because they overbuilt. They significantly overbuilt, and now they don't have enough planes to convert to keep everybody busy. Was a that's not uncommon for China. They overbuilt steel, they overbuilt aluminum, they overbuilt solar, they overbuilt even within their own country, they overbuilt their housing. Making those decisions from the top down is not a winning strategy, in my opinion. We win, but you have to be very, very careful that Chinese won't overcompete. And that wraps us up for today. Hopefully you learned. Hopefully it was worthwhile. Adams Financial Concepts, I think there's a reason why we outperform the Standard & Poor's 500 for our clients, where our clients have done so well. Since the bottom of 2019, they've achieved a return of over 17% compounded annually. And of course, we always have to say legally to say that past performance is no guarantee of future returns. But we think it's because we live in the rainforest. That's the secret of American culture. That's the advantage of America over China. I know that there's at least one Chinaman who believes that I'm wrong. I think I'm right. And so far, we've been proven right. Hopefully, you will too. And with that, I'll close and ask if there's any questions.
Like that was so profoundly informative. I've seen this presentation before, but it got better, and it's that was awesome. As I'm looking at the chat, I don't see any questions queued up at the moment. But
And
there,
I did run long today.
well, you had a lot of information to cover, and it was super important to do that. So, that was really great. So, we'll just give a moment, see if any questions come up. Mike, what are we going to, while we're waiting, what are we talking about next week?
Next week, I want to talk about, uh, and I haven't selected the exact topic, but one article that I read was how much money do people need in retirement to cover just medical expenses?
Hmm.
And as I started to research this, I realized that one of the things when you Google on the internet, one of the fastest growing areas is how to write an eviction paper, how to write an eviction letter to evict people out of assisted living
Wow.
or out of memory care. And I had a client that went through that whole process. So I understand he didn't get evicted, but had he not been with me, he would have been evicted.
Wow.
60% of personal bankruptcies in the country today are due to medical bankruptcies. And with what we're seeing with people kicked off medical insurance and seeing premiums rise, there's a reason why those premiums are rising. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about where we are and why the potential is there to run out of money if you haven't provided for the black swan medical events.
Hmm. Well, I
That's
know
next
I'm looking forward to that next week. Mike, I don't have any questions queued up, so incredible presentation today, and I thank you for it. And as always, you get the final word.
Have a very good week and do consider coming to Adams Financial Concepts. We think we do very, very well for our clients, and our
Mhm.
clients tend to say so. Anyway, with that, have a good week, and I will be back next Thursday.